Biocomputing is going to make a small number of investors a genuine fortune over the next 10 years, and it is going to make almost everybody else absolutely nothing. And I want to open with that because I've sat on both sides of that line more times than I'd like to admit. There is a lab right now with a computer chip in it, and growing on top of that chip are actual human brain cells, real neurons, grown out of skin cells, sitting in a little bath of nutrients wired straight into silicon. And that setup taught itself how to play a video game. No one programmed the moves. Nobody's touching a controller. It watched the screen, got a signal when it did well, and figured the rest out on its own in about a week. Most people see that clip and think that's disturbing. Close the tab. I saw that clip and thought, somebody with a lot of money and a lot of pressure on them made a very strange bet. And strange bets from serious people are usually worth understanding, not laughing at. By the end of this video, you're going to know exactly why that chip exists, what it's really telling you about the biggest companies on Earth, and which businesses are quietly set up to cash in on it. Whether the brain cells ever amount to anything or not. Before I get into any of that, I've got to ask you for something. And I'm going to be straight with you about why what I'm about to lay out took me real time to pull together. Digging through earnings calls, cross-checking numbers, figuring out which companies actually matter versus which ones just make headlines. If you hired somebody to do this kind of digging for you, you'd be writing a check with 3 zeros on it. Easy. I'm not charging you anything. All I'm asking is you hit subscribe right now before the algorithm buries this and you never see the next one. That's the whole deal. Thousands of dollars of digging, and the price of admission is 1 click. Now, here's where I want to slow down, because this is the part almost everybody gets backwards. Everybody covering that brain cell chip is treating it like a horror story. Mad scientist stuff, ethics panic, doom and gloom, on to the next headline. I've built businesses, I've lost businesses, I've watched a lot of smart money do a lot of dumb-looking things, and I learned a long time ago that when a serious, well-funded operation does something that looks completely insane on the surface, your first move should never be to laugh. Your first move should be to ask who's paying for it and why, because nobody funds something genuinely strange unless the normal options have already stopped working for them. Weird cost money and weird costs reputation, and companies don't spend either one for entertainment. So let's actually follow the money, because that's the whole game. The outfit growing those brain cells has raised something like $11 million total since it started. Not a billion million in the world these companies live in. That's pocket change. It's nothing. It barely covers the electric bill of the company we're about to talk about. So let me save you some time right now. No, you can't buy stock in the brain company. It's private. There's no ticker. And if anybody in your comments tells you otherwise, they're either confused or they're trying to sell you something. That's not the trade here. And if you walk away from this video only remembering that, you miss the whole point. The brain in the dish isn't the opportunity. It's a smoke detector going off in a building you can't see into yet. It's proof that some of the wealthiest, most sophisticated organizations on the planet have a problem so severe they're funding literal biological computers to try and dodge it. When I see a signal go off that loud, I don't move on. I go find the fire. The fire, it turns out, is electricity. Plain and simple. The handful of companies running the entire AI boom, the ones whose products you've probably used before breakfast today, are running out of power. Not out of cash, not out of talent, not out of chips even. Believe it or not, out of raw electricity. Once that clicks for you, every strange decision these companies have made over the last couple of years suddenly makes total sense. Let's put real numbers on it, because vague talk doesn't put money in your pocket. Specific numbers do. Your brain, the one you're using right now to follow along, burns about 20 watts. That's less power than the light bulb hanging over your stove. Your refrigerator at home pulls around 400 watts, 20 times what your whole brain needs to run. Now take one single rack of AI servers, one cabinet, about the size of a big fridge freezer, and that thing alone pulls something like 100,000 watts. One cabinet, the electricity draw of a couple hundred houses combined. And these companies aren't buying one cabinet, they're filling entire buildings with them. One of the newer AI data centers being built right now can pull something like 750,000 kilowatts. That's not a building anymore. That's the electrical footprint of a small city. Built to answer emails and generate cat videos faster. Zoom out to the whole industry, and you're looking at something like 485 terawatt hours of electricity already being consumed, expected to roughly double within the next couple of years. Demand for power in this industry is doubling every 2 years, give or take. Meanwhile, building an actual new power supply does not move at that speed, not even close. A new gas turbine has a waiting list stretching multiple years. A new nuclear plant takes a decade to build if everything goes right, longer in most places. And if you try building one in certain countries, add another 5 years just for good measure. So you've got demand doubling every couple years and slamming into supply. That takes 10, 20, sometimes 30 years to build out. That mismatch right there might be the single most important gap in the entire global economy today. And outside of the people whose job it is to worry about it, almost nobody's talking about it. One of the more conservative, buttoned-up research firms in the tech world put out a report saying power shortages could restrict something like 40% of AI data centers within the next year. Not slow down, restrict, meaning hundreds of billions of dollars already committed to buildings and chips could sit there, built and switched off because the electricity to run them never showed up. Think about that for a second. The most expensive collection of empty warehouses in human history, built by the smartest, richest companies that have ever existed because they solved the chip problem faster than anybody solved the power problem. And the market has already noticed. In the country's biggest electricity market, the price utilities pay for guaranteed backup power capacity went from around $28 all the way up to over $329 in about 2 years' time. That's better than an 11 times increase. Regulators actually had to step in and put a ceiling on it because it was starting to move inflation numbers around. That's not a niche technical story buried on page 9 of the business section anymore. That's a systemic one. And systemic problems are where systemic money gets made if you know where to stand. So picture yourself running one of these companies. You got more cash sitting in the bank than most countries generate in a year, and you cannot buy the one thing you actually need. What do? You climb a ladder. There are 4 rungs on it, and I want to walk you up every single one because how far a company has climbed tells you exactly how desperate they've gotten. And desperation, read correctly, is one of the best pieces of information you can get as an investor. Rung 1. Efficiency. Better chips, better cooling, smarter software, squeeze more work out of every watt you've got. Sounds like the obvious answer, and it helps some. Except here's the catch that trips everybody up. When you make something cheaper and faster, people just use more of it. More queries, more requests, more everything. So total electricity demand climbs right back up anyway. Efficiency never actually solves a scarcity problem on its own. It just buys you a little time before the same wall shows back up. Rung 2, buy up the existing grid, sign long contracts, lock in supply years ahead of schedule, use your enormous checkbook to skip the line. Every one of these companies has already done this hard, and it's still not enough on its own. Rung 3 is where this stops being a boring business story and starts being genuinely newsworthy. Nuclear. One of these companies signed a 20-year deal to physically restart a nuclear reactor that had been shut down for years, sitting right next to the site of the worst nuclear accident in American history. And it's the first time a commercial nuclear plant has ever been restarted in this country for this purpose. And it's not a one-off either. You'll find other major players signing their own multi-year, multi-gigawatt power deals around the same time, completely independently. When 4 of the wealthiest companies that have ever existed all quietly start doing the biggest private nuclear power buying spree in history at the same time for the same reason, That's not a coincidence. You can wave away. That's four different companies staring at the exact same wall and reaching for the exact same lever. And rung four is where we started growing human brain cells on a chip, because watt for watt, biology is dramatically more efficient than silicon at certain kinds of computing. When an industry worth trillions of dollars starts funding literal biological computers because regular chips can't keep pace on power, that tells you two things clearly. One, the shortage is enormous. Two, it's going to last, because nobody signs a 20-year power contract and nobody funds an experimental biological chip program to solve a problem they expect to disappear in 18 months. All right, so now you understand the actual problem sitting underneath the freaky headline. Trillions of dollars of enterprise value resting on top of an electricity shortage that could run for a decade or more. Here's exactly where most people get this wrong. They hear power shortage and their first instinct is, great, I'll go buy whatever power company is closest to my house. It doesn't work like that. And understanding why is exactly where the real opportunity is hiding quietly in plain sight. This next part is the one thing you actually need to remember from this whole video. Most power plants and utilities in this country are heavily regulated, which basically means a tech company cannot walk up to a random power plant and just buy its output directly, no matter how much cash they're carrying. It's slow, it's political, it's boxed in by decades of state-by-state rulemaking. But there's a small handful of power plants sitting in deregulated markets, and the companies that own that specific handful of plants are legally free to sign private, direct, multi-decade contracts straight with a tech giant. 20-year deals, guaranteed revenue, locked in, no middleman. How many companies actually own a real fleet of these deregulated plants? You could count them on one hand and still have fingers left. That's not some clever business strategy one of them figured out. It's a legal wall baked directly into how American electricity markets are structured, one state at a time. You cannot out-innovate a wall like that. You cannot undercut it with a better app or a cheaper product. To even attempt competing with it, you'd need to rewrite legislation across a dozen different states at once. Good luck getting that done before the decade's over. That's the real opportunity here, not the flashy AI company everybody's already talking about at dinner parties, not the brain cell company you can't even buy, the handful of unglamorous power companies sitting on top of a legal monopoly, getting paid by the most desperate, best-funded buyers in the history of business. I've said this in front of a lot of different rooms over the years, and it holds up every single time. The boring business sitting quietly in the middle of the supply chain, protected by something the competition legally cannot touch, almost always outperforms the shiny thing everybody's excited about. Everybody wants to own the cool AI company with the slick product demo. Almost nobody wants to own the power company with the confusing earnings call and a stock chart that's gone sideways for a year. And that gap between where the attention is and where the actual money sits is exactly where I go looking every single time, no exceptions. And here's what's genuinely strange about this setup right now. When you pull up the numbers on these companies yourself, their businesses don't look exciting on paper at all. Thin margins, unremarkable growth, stock charts that have actually dropped over the past year, in some cases down 30% or more from their highs. That should stop you cold. Given everything I just walked you through, the demand story is getting more urgent, not less. The 20-year contracts keep getting signed, not canceled. The legal wall protecting these few companies hasn't budged 1 inch. But the stock prices haven't caught up to any of that urgency yet, because most of the market is still filing these under boring old utility stocks instead of recognizing them as the only toll booth standing on the one road leading into the entire AI industry. I also want you to look one layer past the power generators, because there's a second piece of this trade that almost everybody skips right over. It genuinely does not matter in the end who wins the actual generation argument. Nuclear, gas, solar, giant batteries, or something nobody's even heard of yet, whatever wins, that electricity still has to be physically moved, stepped down, switched, and delivered to a building. Somebody has to manufacture the turbines, somebody has to build the transformers, somebody has to run the transmission lines. Those companies simply do not care who wins the generation race, because every single path forward runs directly through their factory floor. One of the largest turbine manufacturers has watched its order backlog roughly climb from around 80 gigawatts to well over 100, and they can only physically produce about 20 gigawatts a year, which puts them sold out roughly 6 years in advance if you tried ordering today. Their electrical grid equipment division alone is sitting on tens of billions of dollars in unfilled orders. And transformers, those unglamorous metal boxes nobody's ever thought twice about, are in a genuine global shortage right now, which means whoever's selling them gets to name the price, not whoever's buying. Think about every gold rush in history for a second. The people who consistently made money weren't the miners gambling everything on striking it rich. It was the people selling the shovels, the tents, and the work pants to every single miner. Whether that particular miner ever found an ounce of gold or not, almost nobody remembers most of those miners' names today. People are still wearing that same denim brand right now, this afternoon. Turbines and transformers are this decade's shovels. It genuinely does not matter which technology wins the generation war, because every single option on the table has to run through that same equipment first. Now, before you go typing anything into your brokerage app, I need to walk you through the trap that catches almost every single person who hears a story like this one, because I've fallen into it myself more than once over the years, and it's an expensive place to fall. You're going to look these companies up, and you're going to see that some of them have already climbed a lot over the past couple of years, and your gut is immediately going to whisper, I'm too late. Everybody already made this money. Move on. That feeling right there has cost people more money over the course of their investing lives than almost any crash you could name, because it pushes you toward one of two mistakes. Either you walk away from something genuinely still worth owning, or you panic and buy it at the worst possible moment because you cannot stomach missing out on it a second time. Both mistakes come from the exact same blind spot. You have no real way to tell the difference between a stock that has simply gone up and a stock that has become genuinely expensive relative to what's still ahead of it. Those are two completely different things, and confusing them is one of the costliest habits in this entire business. Here's how I actually work through it instead. Every single time, no shortcuts. I don't ask myself whether something has already moved. I ask 3 questions in order. Is the underlying demand story getting stronger or weaker from here? Has the structural advantage protecting these companies gone away or gotten weaker? And has the price already caught up with reality? Or is the market still half asleep on it? Run this specific situation through those 3 filters, and here's what you get. Demand for guaranteed power is climbing, not slowing. The legal wall around who that's is allowed to sign these private power deals hasn't moved, and the stock prices of the companies sitting right in the middle of all of it have actually dropped over the past year. Stronger story, same wall, cheaper price. That combination doesn't show up often in a market this expensive overall, and when it does, it's usually worth your attention. One more thing before I get to the risks, because this is the part that separates people who make real money from people who read one article and disappear. The market does not pay you for eventually being right. It pays you for being right before the crowd figures it out and shows up. By the time a story like this one lands on the cover of a mainstream magazine, most of the easy money has already walked out the door with whoever spotted it first. Right now, this particular story is still sitting mostly buried inside earnings call transcripts and dry industry reports, not splashed across headlines. That's usually the window worth paying attention to, not after once everybody at the dinner table suddenly has an opinion about electricity grids. Now let's talk honestly about what could go wrong here, because I'm not going to stand here and tell you this is a lock. And anybody who tells you that about any investment is trying to sell you something you probably shouldn't buy. First risk, A data center announcement is a plan, not a fact. Companies love announcing ambitious projects, and a meaningful chunk of what gets announced quietly never gets built if AI spending cools off faster than expected. This whole demand curve flattens out fast, and these stocks take a real hit. Second, the legal wall protecting these companies exists because of specific state-level rules, and rules can and do get rewritten. These tech giants have enormous lobbying budgets, and if regulators eventually decide to crack these markets open to more competition, that protection gets thinner in a hurry. Third, none of these stocks are cheap relative to what they're earning today, because you're not really paying for this year's profit. You're paying for a story about what they'll be earning several years from now. If that story arrives slower than expected, you overpaid, plain and simple. And fourth, anything touching nuclear timelines has a habit of slipping. A restart targeted for a specific year has a real chance of landing a year or two later than planned, and if it slips, the revenue everybody's counting on slips right along with it. None of that means the underlying idea is wrong. It means you size your position, like somebody who's actually run a business through a couple of bad years instead of somebody betting the rent money on a hot tip from a video. I've watched plenty of genuinely good ideas turn into painful losses over the years, and it was almost never because the idea itself was wrong. It was because somebody seized their bet like they were certain, and certainty simply does not exist in this business. No matter how confident anybody sounds on a stage, in a headline, or in a video exactly like this one. Know before you buy exactly what would have to happen for you to be wrong, and know exactly what you do about it. Figure that part out before you put a single dollar in, never after. So here's the whole thing wrapped up in one sentence. 200,000 human brain cells teaching themselves to play a video game in a lab is not the future you should be scared of. It's a warning light flashing on the dashboard of the biggest companies on the planet, telling anybody paying attention that they are dangerously short on the one resource that cannot be manufactured overnight: electricity. So the freak show gets all the headlines and all the panicked comment sections: the boring power companies, the turbine backlog, the transformer shortage. That's where the actual money is quietly changing hands, while everybody else is busy being creeped out by a science experiment. I've handed you the numbers, I've handed you the companies, and I've handed you the risks, honestly, without sugarcoating any of it. What you do with all of that from here is genuinely on you. And I mean that as respect, not as a brush off, because nobody who actually cares about your money can make that decision for you. And you shouldn't trust anybody who claims they can. What I do want from you before you close this out is simple and concrete. Go pull up the companies I mentioned yourself, read an actual earnings call transcript instead of just glancing at a stock chart and calling it research. Do that homework this week, not someday, not after the next shiny distraction shows up in your feed. And if this video genuinely changed how you're thinking about where the real money in this AI boom is hiding, hit subscribe and send this to the one person in your life who, and still only talking about chips and completely missing the electricity, holding the entire thing up.